Tommy Lynn Sells was an American serial killer who murdered at least 22 people and possibly up to 70 victims across multiple states from 1979 to 1999, earning him the nickname the Coast-to-Coast Killer due to his drifter lifestyle that allowed him to travel the country by freight train and carnival work, targeting vulnerable victims including children, women, and families before being caught after attacking 2 young girls in Del Rio, Texas, leaving one survivor, who identified him and ultimately led to his execution in 2014. Tommy Lynn Sells was born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California, to an unwed mother named Nina Sells. He was born as a fraternal twin alongside his sister Tammy Jean, but their lives would be marked by tragedy from the very beginning. When the twins were just 18 months old, both contracted meningitis, a serious infection of the protective membranes covering the brain and spinal cord. While Tommy survived the illness, his twin sister Tammy Jean died from the infection, leaving the young boy without his closest companion. The question of Tommy's paternity would follow him throughout his life. While an insurance agent named William Sells was officially listed as his father on birth documents, it was more likely that his real biological father was Joe Lovins, a used car salesman. This arrangement was reportedly part of an insurance scam where Lovins had bailed William Sells out of financial trouble, and in return, Sells agreed to claim the children as his own so they could receive health insurance benefits. Much later in life, Tommy would credit Joe Lovins with giving him a piece of advice that would guide his criminal career: dead men tell no tales. After Tammy's death from meningitis, Nina Sells moved with her children to St. Louis, where she had family connections. Tommy's early childhood was characterized by instability and neglect. At the age of 2, Nina sent Tommy away to live with her aunt, Bonnie Walpole, in Holcomb, Missouri. This period with his aunt represented perhaps the only stable and loving relationship of Tommy's early life. Bonnie Walpole later described how Tommy would ride his tricycle up and down the sidewalk during this time, and she genuinely cared for the young boy. However, this brief period of stability would not last. When Tommy was 5 years old, Bonnie Walpole inquired about adopting him, as Nina rarely visited and showed little interest in her son's welfare. Nina's response was swift and angry. She immediately retrieved Tommy from Bonnie's care and refused to allow him any further contact with his aunt. This separation from the one person who had shown him consistent love and care would have lasting psychological effects on the developing child. Back in his mother's care, Tommy's life became increasingly chaotic and harmful. By age 7, he had become a chronic truant, regularly skipping school despite his extraordinarily young age. His mother Nina defended this neglect by saying that Tommy was the kind of child that whatever you wanted him to do, he was going to make sure he did not do it. Going to school was one of those things. This early pattern of defiance and rejection of authority would characterize much of Tommy's later behavior. At the age of 7, Tommy began regularly drinking alcohol that he stole from his maternal grandfather's hidden supply. This early introduction to substance abuse occurred during crucial brain development years and likely contributed to cognitive and emotional problems that would plague him throughout his life. By 8 years old, Tommy's life took an even darker turn when he began spending time with a man named Willis Clark. Willis Clark was an adult man from a nearby town who had befriended the young Tommy. Clark would take the boy on day trips and lavish him with gifts and cash, gradually gaining his trust. Tommy began spending more and more time at Clark's home, eventually sleeping there with increasing frequency. Nina Sells seemed happy to have her son out of her hair and actively encouraged the relationship. What Nina either didn't know or chose to ignore was that Willis Clark was a pedophile who was systematically grooming and sexually abusing Tommy. This sexual abuse would continue for years, with Clark using his position of trust and authority to victimize the vulnerable child. The man would later be identified as a pedophile who molested multiple boys, including Tommy, though he was never formally charged for these crimes. The sexual abuse Tommy endured at the hands of Willis Clark would have profound and lasting effects on his psychological development. Tommy later told investigators that he would relive those experiences while committing his crimes. This connection between his childhood sexual trauma and his later violent behavior illustrates how severe childhood abuse can create lasting psychological damage that manifests in destructive ways. The abuse by Clark was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of adults in Tommy's life failing to protect him or actively putting him in harm's way. Nina's willingness to allow and encourage her son's relationship with Clark Despite the obvious inappropriate nature of an adult man showering gifts on a young boy and having him sleep at his home, demonstrates the level of neglect and poor judgment that characterized Tommy's upbringing. When Tommy was 10 years old, he began using narcotics, further deepening his substance abuse problems. His behavior became increasingly problematic as he struggled with the trauma of his abuse and the lack of stable adult supervision. At age 13, Tommy experienced another devastating blow when his presumed biological father, Joe Lovins, died. This loss stirred up numerous emotions for the troubled teenager. At Lovins' funeral, Tommy attempted to speak to his father during the viewing, but was cut off mid-sentence by his maternal grandmother, who pulled him away and told him to stop it. This rejection and dismissal of his grief added another layer of trauma to Tommy's already damaged psyche. The same year, Tommy's disturbing behavior escalated when he crawled into bed naked with his grandmother, leading to him being banned from the house. The ultimate abandonment came when Tommy was 13 years old. According to his account, he returned home one day to discover that his mother, Nina, and all his siblings had moved away without saying goodbye, leaving him completely alone. While family members later denied this version of events, the sense of abandonment and rejection was clearly real for Tommy. Shortly after this alleged abandonment, Tommy underwent a mental examination after he attempted to rape his own mother. At the age of 14 in 1978, Tommy left his home in St. Louis permanently and began living as a nomad. This marked the beginning of a lifestyle that would define the rest of his life, constantly moving from place to place, never settling down, never forming lasting relationships or taking on responsibilities. He began surviving by riding freight trains around the country, stealing what he needed, and taking whatever odd jobs he could find. This early transition to a nomadic lifestyle was both a symptom of Tommy's psychological damage and a contributing factor to his later criminal career. Without stable housing, employment, or relationships, Tommy had no anchors to keep him grounded or accountable to any community. The transient lifestyle also made it easier for him to commit crimes and then disappear before law enforcement could identify or apprehend him. According to Tommy's own confessions, he committed his first murder at the age of 15 in 1979 while in Mississippi. His account of this first killing reveals the distorted thinking that would characterize his later crimes. Tommy claimed that he had broken into a house intending to commit a burglary when he discovered a man performing oral sex on a young boy. In a fit of rage over what he perceived as child abuse, Tommy claimed he killed the man. However, this confession has never been confirmed by law enforcement, and later evidence suggests that there was no actual molestation taking place. This pattern of Tommy justifying his violence by claiming his victims had somehow provoked or deserved their fate would become a common theme in his confessions. It appears that Tommy created these justifications to make his crimes seem more acceptable, both to investigators and to himself. The following year, in 1980, Tommy claimed to have killed another man with an ice pick near a Chinese restaurant in Los Angeles. Like his first alleged murder, this crime has never been confirmed by law enforcement. What is clear is that Tommy was already engaged in a pattern of violent behavior and criminal activity by his mid-teens. In Oakland, California, a few days after the alleged ice pick murder, Tommy became involved in a gang-related fight in which he was seriously injured and nearly killed another person. He was hospitalized for his injuries and later caused a disturbance by cursing at nurses who tried to treat him. This incident demonstrates both Tommy's propensity for violence and his hostile attitude toward authority figures and people trying to help him. Tommy's criminal behavior inevitably led to his first significant encounter with the criminal justice system. In April 1985, at the age of 20, Tommy was convicted of felony theft in Missouri and served 8 months in prison. This first taste of incarceration did nothing to reform Tommy's behavior or address the underlying psychological issues driving his criminal activity. Upon his release on parole in December 1985, Tommy attempted to get treatment for his substance abuse problems, checking into the New Horizons Rehabilitation Center in July 1985. However, his commitment to rehabilitation was short-lived. When police questioned him about a car theft just 3 days after entering rehab, Tommy fled the facility. This pattern of briefly engaging with help or treatment only to quickly abandon it would repeat throughout Tommy's life. On July 26, 1985, just 4 days after fleeing the rehabilitation center, Tommy committed what law enforcement believes was his first confirmed double murder. In Forsyth, Missouri, He encountered 35-year-old Anna Court and her 4-year-old son Rory at a local carnival where Tommy was working. The details of how Tommy came to be in their home that night vary depending on which version of his confession is believed, but the outcome was tragically clear. According to Tommy's account, he had consensual sex with Anna Court, but then caught her stealing from his backpack. In response, he picked up her son's wooden baseball bat and beat her to death, then killed young Rory because he was a potential witness. However, given Tommy's pattern of lying and creating justifications for his crimes, it's entirely possible that he actually stalked Anna home from the carnival, raped her, and murdered both her and her child in cold blood. The bodies of Anna and Rory Court were discovered 3 days later, bludgeoned to death in their home. By that time, Tommy had already left town, beginning a pattern of committing murders and then quickly moving to new locations that would characterize his entire criminal career. This mobility, combined with his transient lifestyle and lack of connections to any particular community, made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to track him or connect him to his crimes. One of the most brutal and disturbing crimes that Tommy Sells confessed to is the November 1987 murder of the Dardeen family in Ina, Illinois. This crime stands out even among Tommy's confessions for its extreme violence and the vulnerability of its victims. The case involves Keith Dardeen, his pregnant wife Elaine, their 3-year-old son Peter, and the newborn baby girl that Elaine gave birth to during the attack. Tommy provided several different versions of how he came to encounter the Dardeen family, which is typical of his tendency to embellish or alter details of his confessions. In one version, he claimed to have met Keith Dardeen at a truck stop near Mount Vernon, while in another version, he said they met at a local pool hall. In both accounts, Tommy claimed that Keith invited him home for dinner, showing the kind of small-town hospitality that was common in rural Illinois. According to Tommy's confession, after the meal, he was planning to simply move on to the next town, as was his usual pattern. However, he claimed that Keith triggered his anger by making a sexual proposition to him, suggesting either that Keith wanted to have sex with Tommy or that Keith wanted Tommy to join him and his wife in a threesome. Tommy claimed that this sexual advance sent him into an uncontrollable rage, stating, "I was just so pissed off that I took it to the maximum limit." Rage don't have a stop button. In Tommy's account, he forced Keith at gunpoint to drive to a remote location where his body was later found. There, Tommy shot Keith in the head twice, then castrated him before shooting him once more in the head. This extreme mutilation suggests a level of personal rage and hatred that goes beyond what would be expected from a simple robbery or even a killing to eliminate a witness. Tommy then returned to the Dardeen family's mobile home, where he found Elaine and young Peter. What happened next represents some of the most horrific violence in the annals of American crime. Tommy beat Elaine so severely that she went into premature labor and gave birth to her daughter during the attack. The beating was so brutal that both Elaine and Peter died from their injuries. In perhaps the most shocking detail of all, Tommy also beat the newborn baby to death. The crime scene that investigators discovered was beyond comprehension. The mobile home was soaked in blood, and the level of violence inflicted on the victims was extreme even by the standards of homicide investigations. Keith's body was found in a field, shot and castrated, while Elaine, Peter, and the newborn were found beaten to death in their home. However, there are significant doubts about the truthfulness of Tommy's confession to the Dardeen murders. Friends and family members of the Dardeens have questioned several aspects of Tommy's story. They doubt that Keith, who was known to be cautious about strangers, would have invited someone he had just met home for dinner, especially given the atmosphere of fear in the area following several recent killings. They also find Tommy's claim that Keith made a homosexual advance highly unlikely, as they had never perceived Keith as having any interest in other men, and police found no evidence to support this claim during their investigation. Investigators believe that if Tommy did kill the Dardeens, he invented this detail to make the crime seem more justified and to deflect blame onto the victim. Furthermore, when investigators tested Tommy's knowledge of details that had been kept confidential, his answers were inconsistent. He gave incorrect information about which seat of Keith's car he was shot in, and when asked about how Elaine's body was positioned, He first answered incorrectly, then correctly, which investigators believe may have been a lucky guess rather than actual knowledge. Despite these doubts, some investigators still consider Tommy the primary suspect in the Dardenne murders. The county deputy sheriff who interviewed Tommy in his Texas prison cell said Tommy knew details of the crime that had been kept confidential. However, other investigators point out that most of what Tommy told them had previously been reported publicly, making it possible for him to construct his confession from newspaper accounts and other public sources. The Dardenne case illustrates one of the major problems with Tommy's confessions: his tendency to provide multiple, conflicting versions of events, his habit of creating justifications for his violence, and the difficulty of separating truth from fiction in his accounts. While Tommy may indeed have been responsible for this horrific crime, the inconsistencies and embellishments in his confession make it impossible to know for certain what really happened that November night in 1987. Following the Dardenne murders, Tommy continued his deadly journey across the United States, leaving a trail of victims in multiple states. His transient lifestyle, moving by freight train, hitchhiking, and working with traveling carnivals, made him extremely difficult for law enforcement to track. This mobility allowed him to kill in one location and then disappear before authorities could identify him as a suspect. In May 1987, Tommy traveled to New York, where he met 27-year-old Susan Corks. According to his confession, Tommy strangled Suzanne in her apartment near Niagara Falls, then dumped her body. Suzanne's remains were not discovered until 8 years later in 1995, found only 2 miles away from the bar where she was last seen alive. The long delay between her murder and the discovery of her body is typical of Tommy's crimes. By the time victims were found, he had long since moved on to other locations. On October 15, 1987, Tommy killed 21-year-old Stephanie Kelly Stroh near Lovelock, Nevada. According to his confession, Tommy picked up Stephanie while she was hitchhiking, offering her a ride to Reno. They took LSD together, and then Tommy strangled her, covered her body in concrete, and dumped it in a hot spring. Stephanie's body was never found, which is not uncommon for Tommy's victims, as he often took great care to hide or dispose of bodies in locations where they would never be discovered. The year 1988 brought more tragedy as Tommy continued his killing spree. In Salem, New Hampshire, a girl named Melissa Ann Tremblay disappeared and was later discovered dead on railroad tracks. A witness saw Melissa talking to a man matching Tommy's description in a convenience store parking lot before she disappeared. That fall, Tommy used a 3-year-old boy and his mother as props in a begging scheme, traveling with them in a stolen black van. According to investigators, the mother and child never returned from this trip, suggesting they became additional victims of Tommy's violence. On December 18, 1988, Tommy murdered transient Kent Allen Loughton in Tucson, Arizona. According to Tommy's confession, he got into a dispute with a 51-year-old man over a marijuana cigarette and responded by cutting Loughton's throat. This murder demonstrates Tommy's hair-trigger temper and willingness to kill over the most trivial disputes. Throughout 1989, Tommy's killing continued with claims of multiple murders in different states. In January 1989, Tommy claimed to have killed a prostitute in Truckee, Nevada, when he discovered the prostitute was actually a man rather than a woman. In May 1989, he claimed responsibility for killing 2 people in Roseboro, Oregon. The exact details of these crimes are unclear, and some may be fabrications, but the pattern of violence across multiple states is consistent with Tommy's established behavior. As Tommy's criminal career progressed, his violence became increasingly focused on the most vulnerable members of society: children. This shift toward targeting minors represents an escalation in the depravity of his crimes and demonstrates his complete lack of empathy or moral boundaries. In May 1992, Tommy's violence took a different turn when he attacked 20-year-old Fabian Witherspoon in Charleston, West Virginia. Witherspoon had shown kindness to Tommy by taking him home and offering him food and clothing. In return for this generosity, Tommy raped and stabbed her. However, Witherspoon fought back, wrestling the knife away from Tommy and inflicting 23 wounds on him. When Tommy picked up a piano stool and beat her unconscious, Witherspoon miraculously survived. This attack on Witherspoon is significant for several reasons. First, it shows Tommy's complete lack of gratitude or basic human decency. He responded to an act of kindness with brutal violence. Second, It demonstrates that Tommy could be defeated when his victims fought back effectively. Most importantly, Witherspoon later stated that she believed her survival influenced Tommy's future victim selection. After nearly being killed by an adult woman who fought back, Tommy began targeting smaller, more vulnerable victims, primarily children. Tommy was arrested for this attack and took a plea deal on malicious wounding charges, serving 5 years in prison from June 1993 to May 1997. During his incarceration, he married a woman named Nora Price and was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. However, neither marriage nor mental health treatment appear to have any positive effect on his behavior. Upon his release from prison in May 1997, Tommy moved to Tennessee with his new wife. However, he quickly abandoned her and resumed his cross-country travels and criminal activity. Just 4 months after his release, on October 13, 1997, Tommy committed one of his most shocking crimes: the murder of 10-year-old Joel Kirkpatrick in Lawrenceville, Illinois. Joel's murder occurred in the middle of the night when an intruder broke into the family home. Joel's mother, Julie Ray, was awakened by her son's screams and ran to his bedroom, where she encountered a masked intruder. She struggled with the attacker all the way to the backyard, where he struck her and disappeared into the night. When police arrived, they found Joel dead on his bedroom floor, killed with a steak knife taken from the family's kitchen. Initially, police suspected Julie Ray of murdering her own son, and she was actually convicted of the crime. However, years later, after Tommy's arrest, author Diane Fanning wrote to Tommy about the prosecutor's claim that an intruder would not break into a house to commit murder without bringing his own weapon. In his response, Tommy provided specific details about the crime, including the date it occurred, without being given any information about the case. This led to Tommy's confession to Joel's murder and Julie Ray's eventual exoneration. The year 1999 represented the climax of Tommy Sells' criminal career, with a series of particularly brutal murders that would ultimately lead to his capture. These final crimes demonstrate the complete degradation of whatever humanity might have once existed in Tommy, as he targeted increasingly young and innocent victims with escalating savagery. On October 15, 1997, Tommy abducted and murdered 13-year-old Stephanie Mahaney from Springfield, Missouri. According to his confession, Tommy pulled Stephanie from her bed in her home at night, drove her to a remote field, injected her with cocaine, raped her, and strangled her to death. Stephanie's body was found in a farm pond west of Springfield. The injection of cocaine before the sexual assault and murder shows Tommy's cruelty and his desire to maximize his victim's suffering. In April 1999, Tommy committed another double murder in Gibson, Tennessee, killing 31-year-old Deborah Harris and her 8-year-old daughter Ambria Halliburton. Tommy broke into their house at night and raped Deborah in her bed before stabbing her repeatedly with her own kitchen knife, which he left embedded in her chest. When young Ambria witnessed her mother's murder, Tommy stabbed the child 3 times, killing her as well. The following month, on April 18, 1999, Tommy kidnapped 9-year-old Mary Beatrice Perez from a market festival in San Antonio, Texas. Mary B., as she was known, was attending the festival with her family when she became separated from them in the crowd. Tommy found the crying, lost child and convinced her to come with him. He drove Mary B. to a stockyard area nearly 1.5 miles away, where he raped her and strangled her to death with her own t-shirt. Her body was found in a creek bed 10 days later, wearing only a Mickey Mouse t-shirt and a single white sock. Mary B.'s murder is particularly heartbreaking because it represents the predatory nature of Tommy's crimes. He specifically sought out a vulnerable child who was alone and frightened, then exploited her trust and desperation to lead her to her death. The fact that he left her partially clothed in a Mickey Mouse shirt, a symbol of childhood innocence, adds an additional layer of horror to the crime. In May 1999, Tommy traveled to Lexington, Kentucky, where he kidnapped 13-year-old Haley McCone. Tommy abducted Haley from a swing, dragged her into a wooded area, and raped her. He then strangled her to death with her t-shirt and covered her body with debris. Haley's body was found 10 days later, and Tommy was actually arrested in the area around that time for an unrelated charge, though he was not initially connected to her murder. On July 5, 1999, Tommy committed another brutal murder in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, targeting 14-year-old Bobby Lynn Wofford. Tommy picked up Bobby from a Love's convenience store, drove her to a secluded area, and sexually assaulted her. When Bobby tried to escape, Tommy struck her repeatedly with a hatchet and then shot her in the head with a large caliber revolver. He dumped her body off the side of the road, but kept 2 of her earrings as trophies. Bobby's body was found 4 months later, and Tommy was eventually linked to the crime through his confession and the earrings. On December 31st, 1999, New Year's Eve, Tommy Sells committed what would be his final murders in Del Rio, Texas. This crime would also prove to be his downfall, as for the first time in his long criminal career, he would leave behind a living witness who could identify him. Tommy had been living intermittently in Del Rio with Jessica Levry, a local woman he had married after meeting her in 1998 when he came to town as a carnival worker. The relationship was tumultuous, with Tommy frequently leaving town for extended periods to commit crimes elsewhere, then returning to Del Rio when it suited him. Despite his absences and criminal behavior, Jessica continued to take him back, providing him with a base of operations in the border town. On that fateful New Year's Eve, Tommy made his way to a trailer home in the Guajiabe subdivision, west of Del Rio. The trailer belonged to the Harris family, Terry and Crystal Harris, and their children. Tommy had become acquainted with the Harris family through Grace Community Church, which he had begun attending during his time in Del Rio. The family had shown him kindness and friendship, with Tommy even coming to their home to discuss marital problems and job troubles. Sleeping in the trailer that night were 13-year-old Katie Harris and her friend, 10-year-old Crystal Searles, who was visiting from Kansas. The 2 girls were having a sleepover in Katie's bedroom, with Katie sleeping on the bottom bunk and Crystal on the top bunk. Earlier that evening, Tommy had been at a local bar where he had been drinking heavily and making persistent sexual advances toward a woman named Hutchins. According to Hutchins' later testimony, Tommy was obsessed with having sex with her and talked about it all night long, eventually asking for just 5 minutes of her time. When another male patron asked Tommy to leave the bar around 2 a.m., Tommy left in an angry state. Sometime after leaving the bar, Tommy made his way to the Harris trailer with rape and murder on his mind. He found an unlocked window and climbed through it, making his way to the bedroom where the 2 girls were sleeping. Tommy's own confession, recorded on videotape as he walked through the crime scene with investigators, provides a chilling account of what happened next. "I woke this girl up. I said, 'Wake up.' She jumped. I cut her throat," Tommy said of Katie Harris. He had brought a knife from the kitchen and used it to slash the 13-year-old's throat. But Tommy's violence didn't stop there. He also sexually assaulted Katie and stabbed her a total of 16 times. Throughout this horrific attack, 10-year-old Crystal Searles lay motionless on the top bunk, pretending to be asleep while watching the murder of her friend. In her later testimony, Crystal described the terror of that moment. "I think that's when I saw him cut her throat, and I put my hands to my neck because I didn't want him to cut my throat." After killing Katie, Tommy turned his attention to Crystal. She was awake. She just laid there. "I walked over to her and cut this one's throat," he said in his confession. Tommy slashed Crystal's throat, expecting to kill her as he had her friend. However, the knife missed Crystal's vital arteries and trachea, leaving her severely injured but alive. Believing both girls were dead, Tommy left the trailer through the back door. In one of his confessions, he revealed that he had considered killing all 6 people in the trailer that night, including the parents and other children. In another confession, he claimed he had originally intended to rape Crystal Harris, Katie's mother. After Tommy left, Crystal found herself alone with her friend's body, severely injured and fighting for her life. Despite having her throat slashed and being in tremendous pain, the 10-year-old girl managed to get out of bed and seek help. She walked approximately a quarter mile to a neighbor's house, with her severed trachea making it difficult to breathe and impossible to speak clearly. The neighbors who found Crystal on their doorstep were shocked by what they saw: a young girl covered in blood with a gaping wound across her throat. They immediately called for emergency medical help and police. When first responders arrived at the Harris trailer, they found a scene of unimaginable horror, with 13-year-old Katie Harris dead in her bed, surrounded by blood. Crystal was rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. The attack had severed her windpipe completely and nicked her vocal cords, requiring emergency surgery and leaving her dependent on machines to breathe. When her mother arrived at the hospital and saw Crystal in the intensive care unit with tubes and machines keeping her alive, She was devastated. She looked like this baby in this humongous bed, and I looked her in her eyes and I said, "Are you okay? Angel Mommy's here." Her mother later recalled. The attack on Katie Harris and Crystal Searles launched an immediate and intensive police investigation. The brutal nature of the crime, a nighttime attack on two young girls sleeping in their beds, shocked the Del Rio community and law enforcement alike. Detective Larry Pope of the Val Verde County Sheriff's Office was among the first investigators on the scene. When I walked into the crime scene, which was identified as the Harris residence, there was a bedroom which I learned two small girls were sleeping, and on the floor was a deceased young girl. Pope later recalled. The crime scene was extremely bloody. The murder victim was identified as 13-year-old Katie Harris, who normally went by Katie. The key to solving the case lay with Crystal Searles, but investigators initially weren't sure she would survive her injuries. At that point in time, we didn't know to the extent of her injuries, and that was our only hope as far as any surviving witness, Pope explained. As Crystal fought for her life in the hospital, investigators waited anxiously to see if she could provide any information about her attacker. Once Crystal's condition stabilized enough for her to communicate, she was able to provide investigators with a description of the man who had attacked her and killed her friend. Despite her injuries and trauma, the brave 10-year-old worked with a police sketch artist to create a composite drawing of the attacker. The sketch that emerged from Crystal's description showed a man with distinctive features, and investigators began circulating it throughout the community. The breakthrough came when people who knew Tommy Sells recognized him in the sketch. Multiple individuals identified Tommy as the man depicted in the drawing, giving investigators their first solid lead. On January 2nd, 2000, just 2 days after the attack, Tommy Lynn Sells was arrested for the murder of Katie Harris and the attempted murder of Crystal Searles. The speed of his arrest was remarkable, made possible by Crystal's courage and the accurate description she provided despite her severe injuries and trauma. Tommy's capture marked the end of a killing spree that had lasted more than 20 years and spanned multiple states. For the first time in his criminal career, Tommy had made a critical error. He had left behind a witness who could identify him. His assumption that both girls were dead had been wrong, and that mistake would ultimately cost him his life. After his arrest, Tommy Sells began what would become an extensive series of confessions to murders across the United States. Initially cooperative with law enforcement, Tommy seemed eager to talk about his crimes, leading to one of the most complex serial killer investigations in American history. Tommy's willingness to confess surprised investigators. Once Tommy L.Y. Sells was taken to the Val County Sheriff's Office, he was very willing to cooperate with us. Confessions were obtained from him, as well as his agreement to do a walkthrough of the crime scene, Detective Larry Pope recalled. "I thought this to be very odd. Here this guy is under arrest for murder and attempted murder, and is willing to cooperate with us to basically nail the nail in his coffin." The confessions began with the Del Rio attacks, but quickly expanded to include murders in multiple states dating back decades. Tommy claimed to have killed between 50 and 70 people, making him potentially one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. His confessions covered crimes in states including Texas, Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, Nevada, Arkansas, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and others. Texas Ranger John Allen became the primary investigator working with Tommy on his confessions. Allen and Tommy developed what initially appeared to be a productive partnership, with Tommy providing detailed accounts of murders and even agreeing to travel to various crime scenes to help investigators. "I know I am putting nails in my coffin myself, but let me tell you and your readers, I am tired. I am going to try my best to clean my slate of all crimes. I've made my peace with my maker," Tommy wrote to a correspondent on a crime website. The investigation involved extensive travel, with Allen and FBI agents taking Tommy on several out-of-state trips to locations where he claimed to have committed murders. These field trips were designed to test Tommy's knowledge of crime scenes and verify details of his confessions. Some of these trips yielded results. Tommy was able to lead investigators to previously unknown evidence and provide details that only the perpetrator would know. However, as the investigation progressed, inconsistencies began to emerge in Tommy's confessions. By late spring 2000, investigators started noticing that some of Tommy's accounts contained errors or contradicted known facts about the crimes. "I'm taking some time off from working so close with the Rangers. As a matter of fact, I've stopped, for one or two reasons. Too much too fast. They're getting on my nerves as I was getting on theirs," Tommy wrote in May 2000, the partnership between Tommy and the Rangers began to deteriorate as investigators suspected he was fabricating some of his confessions. Detective Larry Pope later said, "He's a con and a half. Tommy tries to dangle stuff in front of me even now, but it just ain't working." The investigators had learned from the experience of Henry Lee Lucas, another serial killer who had falsely confessed to hundreds of murders, and they were determined not to repeat those mistakes. The case of Henry Lee Lucas cast a long shadow over Tommy Sells' confessions and the investigation into his claimed crimes. Lucas, arrested in Texas in 1983, had confessed to approximately 600 murders and was initially considered one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. However, a subsequent investigation by the Dallas Times-Herald revealed that many of Lucas's confessions were false, and he had been manipulating the system to gain privileges and avoid execution. Tommy's defense attorney, Victor Garcia, later revealed that Tommy had explicitly modeled his confession strategy on Lucas's case. The Rangers found out he wasn't being truthful. "I think he tried to play the Henry Lee Lucas game. He told me that Henry Lee Lucas had gotten a life term by confessing to crimes he hadn't done, and he was going to do it too," Garcia said. "He told me he was trying to save his life by making things up." This revelation cast doubt on many of Tommy's confessions, particularly those that could not be independently verified. Like Lucas, Tommy seemed to understand that confessing to unsolved murders could provide him with better treatment in prison, opportunities to travel outside his cell, and potentially help him avoid the death penalty. The system that had been manipulated by Lucas was being manipulated again by Tommy. The Lucas case had damaged the reputation of the Texas Rangers and led to changes in how serial killer confessions were handled. With Tommy's case, investigators tried to be more careful about verifying details and corroborating confessions with physical evidence. However, the sheer volume of Tommy's claims, potentially 70 murders, made thorough investigation of each case extremely difficult. Despite the doubts about some of his confessions, investigators were able to confirm Tommy's involvement in at least 22 murders. Retired Texas Ranger John Allen said, "We did confirm 22. I know there's more. I know there's a lot more. Obviously, we won't ever know." The confirmed cases were those where physical evidence, witness testimony, or other corroborating factors supported Tommy's confessions. The capital murder trial of Tommy Lynn Sells began in September 2000 in Del Rio, Texas, drawing significant media attention due to the brutal nature of the crime and Tommy's status as a suspected serial killer. The case was prosecuted in the old courthouse in downtown Del Rio, with a crew from the television show 48 Hours documenting the proceedings. Selecting a jury proved to be a challenging process, with 500 people called for jury service. It took 14 days to question prospective jurors and seat a panel capable of fairly deciding Tommy's fate. Some potential jurors were dismissed because they said the death penalty was too kind for Tommy, reflecting the community's anger over the crime. Others were dismissed because they opposed the death penalty entirely. Tommy pleaded not guilty to the capital murder of Katie Harris, despite having confessed to the crime multiple times. However, his defense team, led by Victor Garcia, essentially conceded his guilt and focused their efforts on the penalty phase of the trial. "It was just a speed bump on the way to sentencing," Garcia said later about the guilt phase. The prosecution's case was built around several key pieces of evidence: Tommy's written and videotaped confessions, his walkthrough of the crime scene, and most importantly, the testimony of 10-year-old Crystal Searles. The prosecution had to prove not only that Tommy had killed Katie Harris, but that he had done so while intentionally committing another felony, in this case, sexual assault, in order to secure a capital murder conviction. Crystal Searles, now 11 years old, was the star witness for the prosecution. Her testimony was emotionally powerful and legally crucial. She described watching Tommy kill her friend and then attack her, maintaining eye contact with Tommy throughout her testimony. "I think that's what he deserved," Crystal said of the guilty verdict. When asked about her nightmares, she said, "I think I can sleep and not have nightmares, and maybe do better in my own bed. I had to sleep with my mom because they were bad." The prosecution also called several other witnesses to establish Tommy's state of mind and intent on the night of the murders. They put on the stand the woman from the bar, Hutchins, who testified about Tommy's obsessive sexual advances earlier that evening. "He was obsessed with having sex with me. That's all we talked about all night long." At the end, He wanted just 5 minutes of my time, she testified. Tommy's videotaped walkthrough of the crime scene was particularly damaging to his case. In the tape, Tommy calmly explained how he had climbed through the window, awakened Katie Harris, cut her throat, and then attacked Crystal. "I woke this girl up. I said wake up. She jumped. I cut her throat," he said matter-of-factly. The clinical, emotionless way he described the murders shocked observers and demonstrated his complete lack of remorse. The defense offered little in the way of challenging the evidence during the guilt phase. Garcia's strategy was focused on the penalty phase, where he would argue for life in prison rather than death. The evidence against Tommy was overwhelming. He had confessed, been identified by a survivor, and led police through the crime scene. There was no realistic chance of an acquittal. On September 18, 2000, after 3 days of testimony, the jury found Tommy Lynn Sells guilty of capital murder. The verdict was not surprising given the strength of the evidence, but it represented a crucial step toward justice for Katie Harris and closure for her family and Crystal Searles. Following his conviction for capital murder, Tommy faced a separate penalty phase where the jury would decide whether he should be sentenced to death or life in prison without the possibility of parole. The penalty phase of a capital murder trial focuses on aggravating and mitigating factors that might influence the jury's decision about the appropriate punishment. The prosecution presented evidence of Tommy's other crimes and confessions, painting a picture of a remorseless killer who posed a continuing threat to society. They highlighted the particularly brutal and senseless nature of Katie Harris's murder and the fact that Tommy had also attacked 10-year-old Crystal Searles. The sexual assault of Katie Harris was emphasized as an aggravating factor that made the crime especially heinous. The defense, led by Victor Garcia, attempted to present mitigating factors that might spare Tommy's life. They likely focused on his troubled childhood, history of abuse, mental health issues, and substance abuse problems. However, these factors had to be weighed against the overwhelming evidence of Tommy's lengthy criminal history and the brutal nature of his crimes. On September 20th, 2000, the jury sentenced Tommy Lynn Sells to death. The decision reflected the jury's conclusion that the aggravating factors in the case outweighed any mitigating circumstances. Tommy showed no emotion as the sentence was read, maintaining the same cold demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. On November 8, 2000, Tommy was formally received on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky unit near Livingston, Texas, where he was assigned prisoner number 999367. The Polunsky unit houses Texas's male death row inmates in solitary confinement, with prisoners spending 23 hours a day in their cells. This would be Tommy's home for the remainder of his life. Life on death row represented a dramatic change from the nomadic lifestyle Tommy had maintained for most of his adult life. Instead of constantly traveling and moving from place to place, he was now confined to a small cell with minimal human contact. The man who had claimed to be driven by an insatiable need for freedom and movement was now completely restricted in his ability to go anywhere or do anything without supervision. During his years on death row, Tommy continued to give interviews and write letters to journalists, authors, and others interested in his case. He maintained correspondence with several people, including crime writers and researchers who were studying his case. These communications provided additional insights into Tommy's psychology and his perspective on his crimes. While on death row, Tommy continued to confess to additional murders and provide information about unsolved cases. However, his credibility was increasingly questioned as investigators found inconsistencies and outright fabrications in many of his claims. One significant case involved Tommy's confession to the 1997 murder of 10-year-old Joel Kirkpatrick in Illinois. This confession was particularly important because Joel's mother, Julie Ray, had been wrongfully convicted of her son's murder. Tommy's detailed knowledge of the crime, including specific details that had not been made public, helped exonerate Julie Ray and led to her release from prison. However, other confessions were more questionable. Tommy claimed to have killed people in locations where he could not have been present, or provided details that contradicted known facts about the crimes. Some investigators believe Tommy was following the example of Henry Lee Lucas, fabricating confessions to gain attention and privileges. The Dardine family murders represent perhaps the most controversial of Tommy's confessions. While some investigators believe Tommy was responsible for this horrific crime, others question the accuracy of his account. Family members and friends of the Dardines have raised doubts about key elements of Tommy's story, and investigators found inconsistencies when they tested his knowledge of confidential details. Tommy also confessed to numerous other crimes that were never verified, including claims of killing people in various states and dumping bodies in remote locations. Some of these confessions led to searches for additional victims, but many yielded no results. The pattern of true confessions mixed with fabricated ones made it extremely difficult for investigators to determine which of Tommy's claims were credible. During his 14 years on death row, Tommy gave numerous interviews to journalists, documentary filmmakers, and researchers studying serial killers. These interviews provided insights into his psychology and motivations, though they also demonstrated his manipulative nature and tendency to fabricate or embellish details. In interviews, Tommy often displayed a chilling lack of empathy or remorse for his victims. He described killing as giving him a rush similar to drug use, saying, "The first time I did a shot of dope, it was the best feeling I ever had in my life. The first time I killed somebody, it was such a rush. It was just like that, a shot of dope every time I did it, it was that rush again, and I started chasing that high." Tommy also revealed his philosophy about his crimes, saying, "I am hatred. When you look at me, you look at hate. I don't know what love is. Two words I don't like to use is love and sorry, because I'm about hate." He claimed to enjoy watching his victims die, stating, "I like to watch the eyes fade, the pupil fade. It's just like setting their soul free." These interviews served multiple purposes for Tommy. They satisfied his need for attention and notoriety, allowed him to maintain some control over how his story was told, and provided him with human contact beyond the limited interactions available in solitary confinement. However, they also demonstrated his complete lack of genuine remorse or rehabilitation. Tommy was diagnosed with several mental health conditions during his time in prison, including bipolar disorder, personality disorders, and psychosis. However, these diagnoses did not significantly impact his legal case, as he was found competent to stand trial and execute. The mental health issues were seen as explanatory factors rather than excusing factors for his crimes. As Tommy's appeals wound through the court system over more than a decade, the legal landscape surrounding the death penalty began to change, particularly regarding the drugs used in lethal injections. Many pharmaceutical companies, particularly those based in Europe, began refusing to sell their products to state prison systems if they would be used for executions. This created significant challenges for states that used lethal injection as their method of execution. Texas, which carries out more executions than any other state, was particularly affected by these supply issues. The state lost its main supplier of pentobarbital, the drug used in its lethal injection protocol, after the supplier's name became public and the company received threats. In response to these supply problems, Texas turned to compounding pharmacies to produce the drugs needed for executions. However, the state refused to reveal the identity of these suppliers, arguing that disclosing their names would subject them to threats and potentially cut off the supply of execution drugs entirely. Tommy's attorneys seized on this secrecy as a basis for challenging his execution. They argued that Tommy had a right to know the source and composition of the drugs that would be used to kill him in order to ensure they were safe and would not cause unconstitutional pain and suffering. This argument reflected broader concerns about the quality and safety of execution drugs produced by compounding pharmacies, which are not subject to the same regulatory oversight as major pharmaceutical companies. In the weeks leading up to Tommy's scheduled execution date of April 3, 2014, his attorneys filed several legal challenges in both federal and state courts. The primary argument centered on Texas's refusal to disclose information about the pentobarbital that would be used in the execution. On April 2, 2014, U.S. District Judge Vanessa Gilmore issued a preliminary injunction blocking Tommy's execution. Judge Gilmore ruled that the state's refusal to disclose detailed information about the execution drugs violated Tommy's constitutional rights. Until plaintiffs have full disclosure of the product with which Texas will cause their death, they cannot fully develop a challenge to its process, Gilmore wrote. The judge ordered the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to disclose all information about how it obtained the execution drugs, including the names of suppliers and any testing that had been done. However, this victory for Tommy's legal team was short-lived. The Texas Attorney General's office immediately appealed Judge Gilmore's ruling to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. On April 3rd, the appeals court reversed the lower court's decision, and allowed the execution to proceed. The appeals court sided with the state's argument that revealing the drug supplier's identity could subject the company to threats and potentially cut off Texas's supply of execution drugs. Tommy's attorneys then filed an emergency appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court, asking the justices to halt the execution pending review of the drug disclosure issue. However, the Supreme Court declined to intervene, denying the stay of execution request about an hour before Tommy was scheduled to die. The Supreme Court's decision reflected its general reluctance to halt executions based on challenges to lethal injection procedures. The court had previously ruled that inmates challenging execution methods must show that the procedure presents a substantial risk of serious harm and that there are readily available alternatives. Tommy's legal team was unable to meet this high standard, particularly given that pentobarbital had been used successfully in previous executions. On April 3, 2014, at approximately 6:14 p.m. Central Daylight Time, Tommy Lynn Sells was escorted into the execution chamber at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas. The execution chamber is a small, clinical room containing a gurney surrounded by one-way windows that allow witnesses to observe the proceedings while protecting them from any potential violence. Tommy was strapped to the gurney with leather restraints around his arms, legs, and torso. An intravenous line was inserted into each of his arms, through which the lethal dose of pentobarbital would be administered. A chaplain stood near his feet, holding a Bible and providing spiritual comfort during his final moments. When Warden William Lewis asked Tommy if he wanted to make a final statement, Tommy declined, simply saying no. This decision to remain silent in his final moments was consistent with Tommy's general lack of remorse or accountability for his crimes. Unlike some condemned inmates who use their final statement to apologize to victims' families or express regret, Tommy chose to say nothing. Present in the witness viewing area were family members of Tommy's victims, including Terry Harris, the father of 13-year-old Katie Harris, and Mary Torres, the grandmother of 9-year-old Mary Beatrice Perez. Also present were Sean Harris, Katie's brother, and other family members who had waited 14 years to see Tommy face justice for his crimes. At 6:14 p.m., the warden gave the signal to begin the execution process. The pentobarbital, a powerful sedative, began flowing through the intravenous lines into Tommy's arms. According to witnesses, Tommy took a few deep breaths as the drug took effect. His eyes closed, and he began to snore softly. After less than a minute, he stopped moving entirely. The prison medical staff monitored Tommy's vital signs as the drug circulated through his system. At 6:27 p.m., 13 minutes after the drug began flowing, Tommy Lynn Sells was pronounced dead. The man who had terrorized communities across the United States for more than 20 years was finally gone. The execution of Tommy Lynn Sells prompted various reactions from victims' families, law enforcement, and others who had been affected by his crimes. For many, his death represented the end of a long journey toward justice and closure. Terry Harris, whose 13-year-old daughter Katie was murdered by Tommy on New Year's Eve 1999, watched the execution from the witness viewing area. After Tommy was pronounced dead, Harris told reporters, "What a great day." He also commented that the injection was way more gentle than what he gave out, referring to the brutal way his daughter had been killed. Sean Harris, Katie's brother, expressed satisfaction that Tommy could no longer hurt anyone. "I wanted to see him die," he said honestly. "That's honest. I wanted to know that he could no longer hurt anybody." The family's desire to witness Tommy's execution reflected their need to see that justice had finally been served after 14 years of waiting. Mary Torres, the grandmother of 9-year-old Mary Beatrice Perez, also attended the execution. After watching Tommy die, she said, "Whatever went through his veins, he went too quick for my satisfaction. I wanted to see him die." Her comments reflected the deep pain and anger that victims' families continued to feel years after losing their loved ones to Tommy's violence. The families of both girls shook hands and embraced after the execution, united in their grief and their satisfaction that Tommy had finally been held accountable for his crimes. For them, the execution marked not just the end of Tommy's life, but the end of his ability to cause any more pain and suffering. Law enforcement officials who had worked on Tommy's case also expressed satisfaction with the outcome. The investigators, who had spent years trying to determine the truth about Tommy's confessions and link him to various crimes, could finally close the book on one of the most complex serial killer cases in American history. However, the execution also left some questions unanswered. With Tommy's death, investigators lost any chance of getting additional information about unsolved cases he might have been involved in. While Tommy's credibility had been seriously damaged by his false confessions, there remained a possibility that he had committed additional murders that would now never be solved. In the 3 days leading up to his execution, Tommy spent much of his time talking to visitors, according to prison officials. He packed his personal property early on Thursday morning, April 3rd, and was described as reserved but not particularly emotional about his impending death. For his final meal, Tommy requested 3 pancakes, oatmeal, and applesauce. This simple breakfast was far removed from the elaborate last meals that some condemned inmates request. Tommy's modest final meal reflected either a lack of interest in food or a desire not to give his executioners any satisfaction from fulfilling an extravagant request. Throughout his final days, Tommy maintained the same demeanor he had shown throughout his years on death row, relatively calm, manipulative when it served his purposes, and completely lacking in genuine remorse for his crimes. He did not use his final days to reach out to victims' families or express any regret for the pain he had caused. The case of Tommy Lynn Sells had significant impacts on law enforcement practices, victim advocacy, and public understanding of serial crime. His case highlighted both the challenges of investigating crimes committed by highly mobile offenders and the problems created by false confessions. For law enforcement, Tommy's case served as a cautionary tale about the reliability of serial killer confessions. The experience with Henry Lee Lucas had already taught investigators to be skeptical of claims by serial killers, but Tommy's mixture of true and false confessions reinforced the importance of corroborating all claims with physical evidence or other verification. The case also highlighted the challenges of investigating crimes committed by transient offenders. Tommy's ability to commit murders in one location and then quickly move to another state made it extremely difficult for local law enforcement agencies to identify him as a suspect or link him to multiple crimes. This led to increased cooperation and information sharing between law enforcement agencies in different jurisdictions. For victims' families, Tommy's case demonstrated both the importance of survivor testimony and the long journey toward justice in capital cases. Crystal Searles's courage in identifying her attacker and testifying against him was crucial to securing Tommy's conviction and death sentence. Her survival and testimony may have prevented additional murders by ending Tommy's criminal career. The case also highlighted the ongoing debate about the death penalty and execution methods. Tommy's final legal challenges focused on issues of transparency and drug safety that continue to affect capital punishment cases today. The secrecy surrounding execution drug suppliers remains a contentious issue in many states that use lethal injection. Despite Tommy's extensive confessions and the thorough investigation into his crimes, many questions about his true victim count and the full extent of his criminal activity remain unanswered. Investigators confirmed Tommy's involvement in at least 22 murders, but he claimed to have killed up to 70 people. The difficulty in determining Tommy's true victim count stems from several factors. His transient lifestyle meant that he often killed in locations far from where he was known to be living or working, making it difficult to connect him to crimes. Many of his alleged victims were from vulnerable populations, prostitutes, runaways, transients, whose disappearances might not have been immediately reported or thoroughly investigated. Tommy's credibility problems also made it difficult to determine which of his confessions were true. His admission that he had fabricated some confessions to try to avoid the death penalty, combined with investigators' discovery of multiple inconsistencies and impossibilities in his accounts, cast doubt on all of his claims. Some specific cases remain particularly controversial. The Dardine family murders, for which Tommy provided detailed confessions, are still considered unsolved by some investigators who question the accuracy of his account. Other cases that Tommy confessed to have never been fully investigated due to lack of resources or evidence. The geographic scope of Tommy's claimed crimes also raises questions about cases that may never have been connected to him. His travels took him through dozens of states over more than 20 years, and it's possible that murders in some locations were never linked to his presence there. Tommy Lynn Sells died on April 3rd, 2014, at the age of 49, ending one of the most complex and disturbing serial killer cases in American criminal history. His life and crimes represent a study in how childhood trauma, neglect, and abuse can create monsters who inflict unimaginable suffering on innocent people. From his troubled birth as a twin whose sister died of meningitis, through his abandonment by family members, sexual abuse by pedophiles, and descent into substance abuse and violence, Tommy's early life reads like a textbook case of factors that can contribute to the development of a serial killer. However, millions of children suffer abuse and neglect without becoming murderers, highlighting the complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors that create violent criminals. Tommy's crimes span more than 20 years and multiple states, leaving a trail of devastation that affected dozens of families and communities. His victims ranged from infants to adults, demonstrating his complete lack of empathy or moral boundaries. The brutality of his attacks, particularly those targeting children, shocked even experienced investigators and prosecutors. The investigation into Tommy's crimes represented one of the most extensive serial killer investigations in American history, involving multiple law enforcement agencies and spanning numerous jurisdictions. The case highlighted both the challenges of investigating crimes committed by highly mobile offenders and the problems created by false confessions mixed with true admissions. Perhaps most importantly, Tommy's case demonstrated the crucial role that survivors and witnesses play in bringing serial killers to justice. Without the courage and survival of 10-year-old Crystal Searles, Tommy might never have been caught and could have continued killing for years. Her bravery in identifying her attacker and testifying against him in court was instrumental in securing his conviction and death sentence. The execution of Tommy Lynn Sells provided closure for some victims' families and ensured that he could never harm anyone again. However, it also meant that questions about his true victim count and involvement in other unsolved cases would likely never be answered. His death marked the end of a criminal career that spanned more than 2 decades and left an indelible mark on American criminal history. Tommy Lynn Sells' story serves as a reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within some individuals and the devastating impact that one person can have on countless lives. It also highlights the importance of protecting vulnerable children, supporting survivors of violent crime, and maintaining effective law enforcement cooperation to catch dangerous predators before they can claim more victims. His name will be remembered not for any positive contribution to society, but as a cautionary tale of how untreated trauma and unchecked violence can create monsters who destroy everything they touch. The man who called himself Hatred and claimed he didn't know what love meant died alone on a gurney in a Texas prison, having spent his final years in solitary confinement. His death brought an end to one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, but the pain and trauma he inflicted on his victims and their families will continue long after his execution. Tommy Lynn Sells lived as a destroyer of lives and died as a forgotten man, leaving behind only grief, unanswered questions.